This message wasn't scheduled. If you're hearing it, it's because something stayed open longer than it should have. There are systems designed to hold things in place. Trees that remember where a promise was made. Houses that repeat a routine long after the person is gone. Roads that remain safe only if you acknowledge them. Pipes that keep voices from rising where they don't belong. And routes that exist only when you agree to pay their price. These systems don't break. They adapt. Tonight's stories are not warnings. They are recordings. Each one captures a moment when someone crossed a line they didn't know was still being enforced. No monsters appear. No curses are announced. Just rules that were already there, waiting for someone to notice them too late. You don't need to be afraid. Listening does not activate anything. But if, at some point tonight, you feel the urge to check the room around you, or to adjust the way you're breathing, that's simply your body recognizing a pattern. The stories will continue in a moment. Please do not interrupt them. Some systems require a complete cycle. The witness tree of Briar Hollow. Silas arrived in Briar Hollow just after dusk, when the fog had already begun to lift itself from the creek beds and settle higher, clinging to fence posts and low branches like something uncertain of its own shape. His truck rolled slowly along the gravel road, tires crunching with a sound that felt too loud for a place that had learned, over generations, how to listen more than it spoke. The hollow looked smaller than he remembered. Or perhaps he had simply grown used to wider horizons, open job sites, long highways, towns where nothing watched you back. Here, the hills leaned inward. The trees stood closer. Even the sky felt narrower, as though it had been folded down to better observe what returned. He cut the engine near the old boundary marker and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing in the smell of damp earth and leaf rot and something faintly metallic beneath it all. The air tasted like rain that hadn't fallen yet. The witness tree stood exactly where it always had, a white oak, massive and split slightly down its eastern side, its bark ridged and furrowed like a map of old injuries. Generations ago, the tree had been marked as the boundary between two farms. Its roots trusted more than fences, its presence more enduring than any inked line on paper. Surveyors came and went, deeds were rewritten. But the oak remained, silently confirming where one claim ended and another began. Silas had not planned to stop here. He told himself that as he opened the truck door and stepped out into the fog, told himself it was coincidence, that he needed to stretch his legs, that the long drive had stiffened his back, but the truth was simpler and harder to swallow. He needed to see if the tree remembered him. The ground beneath his boots was soft, saturated with weeks of mist and recent rain. Each step made a muted sound, as though the earth itself were breathing along with him. Crickets hummed somewhere deeper in the hollow, their rhythm uneven, punctuated by long pauses that made Silas acutely aware of the silence in between. He stopped a few feet from the trunk. Up close, the tree seemed larger than memory allowed. Its lower branches twisted outward, heavy with moss that swayed slightly even though there was no wind. The bark bore scars old blazes from surveyor marks, initials carved by hands that no longer existed. Some of those marks had been swallowed by growth. Others remained, distorted but legible, preserved by accident or intent. Silas lifted his hand, hesitated, then let it fall back to his side. 10 years, he thought. 10 years since he'd left without saying goodbye to anyone except his mother, and even that farewell had been hurried, unfinished. 10 years since he'd last stood at this line, pretending it was just a tree. The fog thickened, curling around his calves, dampening the cuffs of his jeans. The hollow grew quieter, as if the night were holding its breath. That was when he heard it. Not a voice. Not exactly. A sound, close and measured, emerging from the rough surface of the bark itself. Soft enough that he almost dismissed it as imagination, or the settling of wood cooling after a long day of sun. One, the word, or the shape of it, was followed by a pause, long enough for Silas's chest to tighten, for his lungs to draw in air that felt unexpectedly dry. Two, another pause, this one shorter. Stop. The sound ended abruptly, as if cut off mid-breath. Silas stepped back, heart hammering against his ribs. His first instinct was embarrassment, a sharp, irrational flare of it. Talking trees were not real. Whispering bark belonged to stories told on porches, to warnings meant for children who wandered too far after dark. He laughed, a short, brittle sound that vanished into the fog. "Get a grip," he muttered, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. He waited. Nothing followed. No repetition, no echo. The oak stood silent, massive, indifferent. Silas exhaled slowly and rubbed his palms against his jeans. The skin felt dry, tighter than usual. He told himself the sound had been wind moving through a hollow in the trunk, or his own breathing reflected back at him by the close-set trees. Still, he did not approach again. He got back into the truck and drove the remaining mile to the old house, the witness tree shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was swallowed by fog and distance. That night, sleep came in fragments. Silas lay in his childhood bed, the ceiling above him traced with familiar cracks that looked like branching roots when the moonlight shifted. The house creaked as it always had, a language of settling wood and distant animal movement that once meant safety. Now it felt like a conversation he could no longer fully translate. Each time he drifted close to sleep, he became aware of his breathing. In, out, in, out. He would catch himself holding his breath without realizing it, lungs locked, chest aching faintly as though he'd forgotten how to complete the cycle. When he forced himself to inhale, the air felt thin, insufficient, like breathing through cloth. At some point before dawn, he dreamed of sap, not the amber sweetness he remembered from childhood, when he and the other kids would press sticks into wounded bark and watch the resin bead and harden. This sap was darker, sluggish, seeping from cracks in the ground itself. It smelled of iron and wet pennies, of old tools left out in the rain. In the dream, his hands were submerged in it. When he woke, his fingers were numb, tingling as if circulation had been cut off and only just returned. The following evening, Silas found himself walking the boundary road again without consciously deciding to do so. The fog was thicker now, rolling in low waves that erased distance. The witness tree emerged gradually, its silhouette forming piece by piece, a curve of trunk, a drooping limb, the pale suggestion of lichen catching what little light remained. He stopped farther back this time. The sound came immediately. 1. The pause felt longer, expectant. 2. His chest tightened in response, breath stalling halfway through an inhale. Stop. Silas exhaled sharply, stumbling backward as if the word had struck him physically. His pulse roared in his ears. He pressed a hand to his sternum, suddenly aware of how shallow his breathing had become. "This isn't real," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. The bark rippled, not visibly, not in any way he could point to or describe afterward, but the sense of movement was undeniable, like watching muscles shift beneath skin. A memory rose unbidden, sharp and unwelcome. Alara's laugh, breathless and low, carried on summer air heavy with cicadas. The two of them standing barefoot at the base of the oak, hands slick with heat and resin, the way the sap had burned slightly as it touched skin, sealing around their pressed fingerprints as if eager to hold them. A promise spoken too young, too certain. Silas turned away before the memory could settle further. He walked back toward the house, steps uneven, lungs aching as though he'd run much farther than the short distance allowed. Behind him, the witness tree remained silent, but the rhythm followed him, not as sound this time, as sensation. In, out, in, out. He did not sleep at all that night. By morning, faint lines had appeared along his forearms, darkened streaks beneath the skin, branching subtly from wrist to elbow. He pressed on them, expecting pain, but felt only a dull resistance, like pressing against hardened muscle that did not quite belong to him. Outside, the fog lifted slowly from Briar Hollow, and the witness tree waited. By the third morning, Silas had stopped pretending the marks on his arms were bruises. They had deepened overnight, the faint lines darkening into something closer to grain, long, narrow striations that followed the natural pathways beneath his skin, as if his body were being quietly diagrammed by an unseen hand. When he flexed his wrist, the lines shifted subtly, not cracking or fading like discoloration should. but stretching with a resistance that reminded him of cured wood bending under pressure. He stood in the bathroom, sleeves rolled up, studying his reflection in the mirror as pale light leaked through the small window above the sink. The house smelled the way it always had in the morning. Old soap, cold iron pipes, a hint of mildew in the walls. Familiar. Safe. His arms did not belong in that picture. Silas pressed his thumb into one of the darker veins near his forearm. The skin was cool, firmer than the surrounding flesh. There was no pain, just an unsettling lack of give, as though something beneath had already decided its final shape. He let his arm fall and turned away from the mirror. Downstairs, he brewed coffee he didn't want, and drank it anyway, more for the heat than the taste. Each swallow scraped faintly on the way down. His throat felt dry no matter how much he drank, the sensation persistent and oddly specific, like thirst that water alone could not touch. The local hardware store was open by 8. Silas walked there instead of driving, needing the movement, the proof that he could still put one foot in front of the other without consequence. The road cut close to the boundary line, and even though the fog had lifted, he felt the witness tree's presence long before it came into view, a pressure behind his eyes, a tightening in his chest that coincided too neatly with each breath. He did not look at it as he passed. Inside the store, the air smelled of sawdust and oil. Pegboards lined the walls, their familiar outlines of comfort. Tools had rules. Wood behaved according to grain and moisture and pressure. It could be shaped, repaired, measured. Silas lingered longer than necessary, running his fingers along handles and boards, grounding himself in textures that answered honestly to touch. No counting, no pauses. At the counter, Mrs. Klein rang up his purchase without comment, though her eyes flicked briefly to his arms, where his sleeves had ridden up. Her smile wavered, just enough to register. "You back for good?" she asked, voice casual but curious. "Not sure yet," Silas said. She nodded as if that answer confirmed something she already suspected. By the time he left, the air outside had grown heavy again, clouds pressing low over the hollow. The path home felt longer. Each breath required a conscious effort, as though the rhythm that had once belonged to his body now demanded permission. He turned down the dirt road to avoid passing the tree. The detour brought him near the old mill site, where the creek widened and slowed. The water there carried a reddish tint from minerals in the rock, staining the stones along the bank. Silas crouched and dipped his fingers in, watching the current slip between them. For a moment, just a moment, the water thickened, not visibly, not enough to call it real, but the sensation lingered, a subtle drag against his skin, like sap warming in the sun. He pulled his hand free and wiped it on his jeans, heart beating faster. Alara came back to him in pieces, not as she was at the end, sharp-edged, distant, but as she had been before everything calcified into promises. The way she used to stand too close when she spoke, as if proximity alone could anchor her. The habit she had of pressing her thumb into his wrist when she was thinking, feeling for his pulse. That memory brought an unexpected ache. It had been Alara's idea, the oath. They were barely more than kids, standing barefoot at the boundary line with the cicadas screaming overhead. The old oak loomed above them, its leaves whispering in a way that felt conspiratorial. She had pressed her hand to the bark first, wincing as the sap bubbled up, hot and sticky. "Everything here listens," she'd said. "This tree keeps count." Silas had laughed then, fearless in the way only the young can afford to be. Still, he pressed his hand beside hers. The sap had sealed around their fingerprints, glossy and dark, holding the shape of them as it cooled. A biological ink, binding skin to wood. They had sworn they would never leave the hollow, never let outsiders claim the land, never break what was shared. It felt important at the time. It felt permanent. Silas straightened abruptly, breath hitching as the memory completed itself. His lungs burned faintly, as if reprimanded for wandering too close to something already claimed. That afternoon, he went to see Mrs. Eldrith. Her office sat just off the main road, a narrow building that smelled of paper and dust and old ink, the kind of place where records slept but never truly rested. Shelves bowed under the weight of ledgers, their spines cracked and faded, labeled in careful script. Mrs. Eldrith herself looked much the same as Silas remembered, thin, upright, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her hair was pinned back severely, gray shot through with white, giving her the appearance of something carved rather than aged. She looked up as he entered, gaze lingering a fraction too long. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. Silas swallowed. "I need to check a boundary record. Briar Hollow, the old oak line." Her pen paused mid-scratch. "That tree again," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She rose without asking further questions and moved toward the back, fingers trailing along the spines as if reading them by touch alone. The ledger she pulled was thick, its pages yellowed and heavy with use. She set it down and opened it carefully. Silas leaned over her shoulder, eyes scanning the familiar map lines, the names he recognized as families, the Laras, neighbors, long gone. His name was there, then it wasn't. Where Silas Mercer should have been, there was a small, careful drawing instead. A tree, not symbolic, not decorative, precise, roots mapped beneath it, branches spreading outward, ink pressed deep into the page as though the pen had hesitated, then committed. Silas's breath caught painfully, his chest tightening until the room seemed to tilt. Mrs. Eldrith closed the book gently. "Some marks," she said quietly. "Don't stay where you put them." Then hadn't I? He tried to speak, but only a shallow rasp emerged. His lungs felt dry, hollow, as if something were drawing the air out before it could reach him. Outside, the wind stirred, and somewhere, at the boundary of Briar Hollow, the witness tree counted. By the 5th day, Silas began to understand that his breathing no longer belonged entirely to him. It wasn't that he couldn't inhale. His lungs still filled, his chest still rose and fell, but the timing had changed. The instinctive rhythm, something he had never noticed until it was gone, had been replaced by something measured, deliberate, as though an external hand were keeping count. In, pause, out, pause. If he tried to rush it, his lungs burned. If he tried to ignore it, his chest locked halfway through an inhale, muscles seizing in quiet protest until he surrendered and followed the pace that had been set for him. 1, the rhythm seemed to say without sound. 2, stop. I'm cold skin. Silas found himself standing still at odd moments by the sink, halfway up the stairs, in the middle of the yard, waiting for permission to breathe again. His body obeyed without argument, as though this new cadence had always been there, hidden beneath the old one. The lines along his arms had darkened further. They no longer looked like marks beneath the skin. They looked like something growing within it, branching paths of deep brown and gray, following muscle and tendon, curving around bone. When he flexed his fingers, a faint stiffness resisted him, subtle but unmistakable. Wood did not like to be rushed. The smell came next. It followed him everywhere, faint but persistent. Not blood, not rot. Something older and more specific iron left too long in damp soil. Rusted nails pulled from beams that had collapsed decades ago. The scent clung to his clothes, to his hands, to the inside of his throat. He scrubbed his arms raw in the shower, watching the water bead unnaturally on his skin before running off in thin streams. The smell remained. If anything, heat made it stronger. By evening, he stopped fighting it. Silas walked to the boundary at dusk, his feet carrying him there with a certainty that frightened him more than the counting ever had. The fog was already thickening, pooling low to the ground, blurring the edges of the hollow until distance became meaningless. The witness tree loomed out of the mist, patient and immense. Up close, the bark glistened faintly in places, darkened by fresh sap. It seeped slowly from hairline cracks, thick and viscous, trailing downward in uneven lines that caught the last light of day. The smell was overwhelming now. Silas stood at the base of the trunk, heart hammering, lungs struggling to keep pace with the borrowed rhythm. He raised his hand before he could stop himself. The sap was warm, not hot enough to burn, not yet, but warmer than it should have been, pulsing faintly beneath his fingers as though responding to his touch. The moment skin met resin, sharp pressure flared in his chest, stealing his breath completely. He staggered back, gasping, hands clawing at empty air until the rhythm resumed on its own. "You already know me," he whispered hoarsely. "Haven't you taken enough?" The tree did not answer. Instead, something shifted inside him, a tightening deep in his lungs, as if the smallest passages were closing, narrowing with each measured breath. He could still breathe, but less. Each inhale brought in just enough air to continue. Nothing extra, nothing wasted. The witness tree was efficient. Silas backed away, nearly tripping over an exposed root. His heel struck it hard, pain jolting up his leg. He cried out, the sound sharp in the fog. The pain grounded him. He turned and fled, lungs burning, breath faltering with each forced step, until the house came into view through the trees. That night, he dreamed with his eyes open. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths he no longer controlled. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, stretching, merging. The smell of iron filled the air, thick enough to taste. And then Alara was there, not standing, not whole. She was pressed into the walls, into the grain of the old wood. Her shape suggested rather than formed. Her hair trailed along the ceiling like roots, searching for soil. Her eyes too clear, too aware, fixed on him with something that was not accusation, but expectation. "You left," she said, though her lips did not move. Silas tried to answer. No sound came. "The tree doesn't forget," she continued. "It only waits." Her hand emerged from the wall beside him, fingers elongated, bark textured, the nails dark and blunt. She pressed her palm to his chest, directly over his heart. He felt his lungs tighten instantly. "You promised to stay," she whispered. "One of us has to." He woke, choking, sitting bolt upright as air finally rushed back into his lungs in a painful, desperate gasp. His heart pounded wildly, each beat echoing in his ears. Morning light crept in slowly. The marks on his arms had spread overnight, branching higher toward his shoulders. At his wrists, the darkened grain had thickened into a continuous band, encircling the skin completely. Like a ring, Silas wrapped his arms around himself, suddenly acutely aware of the shape his body was taking, not flesh alone anymore, but something layered, something claimed. Outside, the wind moved through the hollow, and at the boundary, the witness tree listened. By the seventh day, Silas could no longer walk the hollow without stopping, not because his legs failed him, those still held, stubborn and strong, but because his lungs demanded obedience. Every dozen steps or so, his body would simply halt, muscles locking until the rhythm allowed him to continue. In, pause, out, pause. It was no longer frightening in the sharp way fear usually was. It had settled into something heavier, a dull, suffocating certainty. He went to see Mrs. Eldrith again because there was nowhere else left to go. The office smelled different this time. Not dust and paper, but sap. Silas noticed it immediately, his throat tightening reflexively as the iron sweet scent coated the air. Mrs. Eldrith sat behind her desk as before, posture unchanged, hands folded neatly atop the ledger. "You're late," she said. Silas gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles pale. "You knew." She met his gaze calmly. "I knew you'd come back." "Why, that tree." His breath caught. He waited for the pause to pass before continuing. "That tree is taking me." Mrs. Eldrith inclined her head slightly. "It's keeping you." She stood and gestured for him to follow her into the back room, where the shelves grew narrower and the light dimmer. There were no windows here, only a single hanging bulb that cast long shadows over the ledger's stacked floor to ceiling. "These records go back farther than the county," she said, pulling one free. "Before boundaries were measured by lines instead of lives." She opened the book. Inside were no names at first, only drawings, trees, stones, creeks, each carefully rendered, annotated with dates and brief notations written in a tight, deliberate hand. Witness taken, contract fulfilled, wind restored. Silas's chest tightened painfully. "What does that mean?" he asked. Mrs. Eldrith turned a page. "This hollow was settled slowly," she said. "People came with deeds, but the land didn't recognize paper, so they learned another way." She tapped the drawing of a large oak, nearly identical to the one at the boundary. "A witness," she continued. "Something that could remember who belonged where. Who promised what? Silas swallowed. And if someone broke that promise, then the tree corrected the imbalance. She turned the ledger toward him. A familiar shape stared back, branches spread wide, roots curling inward. Next to it, in smaller script, was a single sentence. One must remain to speak for the land. Silas's vision blurred at the edges. Alara, he said. She stayed. Mrs. Eldrith's silence confirmed it. She tried to leave. The older woman said quietly, "After you were gone." She thought the oath had been childish, symbolic. Silas closed his eyes, a pressure building behind them that had nothing to do with tears. The tree didn't agree. Mrs. Eldrith went on. It took her breath first. Just a little. Enough to remind her of the contract. What happened to her? Silas asked, already knowing the shape of the answer. She became what the hollow needed, Mrs. Eldrith said. The wind through the leaves, the sound that keeps the boundary intact. Silas's lungs spasmed violently. He bent forward, gasping, fingers clawing at his chest as the rhythm faltered. Mrs. Eldrith waited. She always waited. When the breath returned, weaker than before, Silas straightened slowly. "And now it wants me," he said. "It wants balance," she replied. Two voices held the promise. One left, one stayed. Now the tree is collecting what it's owed. Silas laughed, the sound breaking apart as it left him. "You're talking about me like I'm already gone." Mrs. Eldrith's eyes softened. "Just barely. You stopped being listed as a person the moment your name faded from the record," she said. "You're in transition." Outside, the wind picked up. Silas felt it immediately, felt it inside him, moving through spaces that used to be filled with air. His breath came shallow now, each inhale thinner than the last. "Is there a way out?" he asked. Mrs. Eldrith hesitated. "There is," she said at last, "but it costs the tree what keeps it alive." Silas looked at her sharply. "Memory," she continued. "The tree feeds on what was promised, on what was never finished." Minga, he thought of Alara's letters unsent, folded carefully and tucked away in a box beneath his bed. Words he had written and rewritten but never allowed to reach her. A future imagined but abandoned. Fuel. The wind outside howled suddenly, rattling the shelves. The bulb overhead flickered. The witness tree was listening. Silas pushed away from the desk. "If I do this," he said, voice ragged, "I walk away." Mrs. Eldrith did not contradict him, but her eyes lingered on his wrists, where the dark bands had thickened, pressing visibly against the skin. "Some marks don't disappear," she said. Silas left without another word. By the time he reached the house, the fog had returned, thick and low, curling around his ankles like roots testing soil. He moved slowly now, stopping often, breath growing shallower with each pause. Inside, he went straight to the bedroom. The box was still where he'd left it. He sat on the edge of the bed, opening it with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the effort of movement. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, written over years, each one an attempt to finish something he'd abandoned. He held the top one briefly, feeling the weight of the words pressed into paper. Then he stood. Outside, the witness tree waited. Silas reached the boundary just before night fully settled. The fog lay thick across Briar Hollow, heavy and low, as though the land itself were exhaling. The witness tree stood half submerged in it, trunk rising from the mist like the mast of a ship long since grounded. Its branches were still. Not a leaf moved. For the first time since his return, the counting did not begin when he approached. That absence frightened him more than the sound ever had. Silas stopped at the edge of the roots, chest tight, lungs drawing only the smallest allowance of air. Each breath scraped faintly, shallow and cautious, as if his body already understood it was no longer entitled to more. He knelt slowly, every movement measured, and set the box of letters down on the damp earth. The ground beneath the oak was different, harder, compacted by years of standing witness. The roots surfaced in places, thick and pale, twisting outward like knuckles pressing up through skin. Sap glistened along the bark, darker now, almost black, trailing downward in thin, deliberate lines. Silas opened the box. The letters smelled faintly of old paper and dust, but beneath that was something warmer, more personal. The residue of time spent holding them, of thoughts shaped and reshaped, but never released. He lifted one, then another, laying them carefully at the base of the trunk. Each page felt heavier than it should have. He struck the match with hands that barely trembled. The flame bloomed small and steady, its light reflected briefly in the wet bark. Silas hesitated, not out of doubt, but recognition. These words had been the last thing that truly belonged to him. Unfinished futures. Apologies never delivered. A promise sustained not by action, but by memory. Fuel. He touched the flame to the paper. The fire caught slowly, reluctant at first, then eager. The letters curled inward as they burned, ink darkening, words collapsing into ash before they could be read aloud. Smoke rose thick and sweet, carrying the scent of iron and resin, and something unmistakably human. The witness tree responded. The sap began to flow faster, pulsing from the bark in heavy drops that struck the ground with soft, wet sounds. The fog stirred, drawn inward toward the trunk, circling as if caught in an unseen current. Silas's chest seized. For a terrible moment, he thought the tree was taking the rest, that this was the final collection, the last breath claimed in payment. His vision narrowed, edges darkening as his lungs struggled uselessly against the tightening grip. Then, silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of pressure. The rhythm loosened. Silas inhaled sharply, deeply, air flooding his lungs with a painful rush that made him gasp aloud. He coughed, dragged another breath in, then another, each one fuller than the last. The burning stopped. The letters were gone, reduced to a smear of ash and blackened fragments at the base of the tree. The sap slowed, then stilled entirely, hardening where it clung to the bark. The fog began to thin. Silas remained kneeling, hands braced against the earth, breathing hard, stunned by the sheer excess of air his body had been denied for days. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, loud and insistent, gloriously his own. When he finally looked up, the witness tree stood unchanged. It did not groan. It did not shudder or split. It simply was, as it had always been. Silas stood unsteadily and took a step back. Nothing stopped him. He took another. The ground held. The air remained. He turned and walked away from the boundary, each step deliberate, cautious, until the tree receded into the fog behind him. The hollow did not follow. By morning, Briar Hollow felt quieter, not peaceful. Never that. But the air moved more freely, wind threading through the hills without resistance, without voice. The oak still stood at the boundary, its branches creaking softly when the breeze passed through. But the sound carried no cadence, no counting, just leaves. Silas packed his truck without ceremony. As he closed the tailgate, he noticed the mark on his wrist. The dark band of wood grain had not faded. It circled his skin completely, deep and permanent. The texture faintly raised beneath his fingers. When he pressed on it, the skin resisted not painfully, but firmly, as though something beneath remembered a shape it refused to relinquish. A ring, a boundary, a reminder. Silas drove out of Briar Hollow without looking back. Miles later, when the hills flattened and the trees thinned, he rolled down the window and breathed deeply, greedily, filling his lungs again and again. The air tasted different here, cleaner, unclaimed, still. When the wind shifted just right, he thought he heard it. Not a voice, not words, just a pause in the movement of air, the hesitation that made his breath falter for the briefest instant before continuing on its own. In, out. Silas tightened his grip on the wheel and kept driving. Behind him, in the hollow that no longer spoke, the witness tree stood watch, and the land remembered. The kitchen that finishes the dishes. At 2:13 day, and the sound was precise enough to wake her. Not loud, not sudden, just exact. Ceramic touching ceramic. A soft clink, followed by a pause, then another, slightly farther away. The sound carried through the duplex with the patience of someone who knew they would not be ignored. Marianne opened her eyes and lay still, listening. Rain pressed steadily against the windows, the same way it had every night since she moved into the place. Fine, persistent, uncommitted to stopping. The bedroom was dark except for the faint green glow of the digital clock on her nightstand. 2:13. The sound came again. This time she recognized it clearly. Plates. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself not to sit up too quickly. After years on night shifts at the hospital, her body had learned not to panic at being awake at odd hours. Sounds at night were usually explainable. Pipes, settling wood, neighbors. Still, she waited. Clink, pause, clink. There was a rhythm to it. Not random. Not careless. Marianne swung her legs over the side of the bed and pulled on a sweater. The floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. The duplex creaked softly as she moved, the building old enough to respond to weight like a living thing. She stepped into the hallway. The kitchen light was off. The sound came again, unmistakably from downstairs now, followed by the faint scrape of something being set down with care. Marianne descended the narrow staircase slowly, one hand trailing along the wall. The smell hit her before the sight of anything did not rot, not damp, but clean. Too clean. The sharp, mineral scent of soap and hot water that had already cooled. She reached the bottom step and flipped on the light. The kitchen stood perfectly still. The sink was empty, dry. Every plate, bowl, and cup she had left soaking after dinner was gone, stacked neatly on the counter. Not just stacked, arranged. Plates largest to smallest. Bowls nested inside one another. Mugs aligned with their handles facing the same direction. Marianne frowned. She crossed the room and ran her fingers along the edge of the counter. No moisture. No lingering heat. The drying rack beside the sink was also empty, folded down exactly the way Mrs. Sterling had shown her on the day she moved in. Marianne's stomach tightened. Mrs. Sterling had been very particular. Even when she was alive, the woman treated the kitchen like a controlled environment. Every item had a place. Every action had a preferred sequence. Marianne remembered the tour vividly. Mrs. Sterling standing stiffly by the counter, correcting her gently but firmly when she reached for the wrong cabinet. "Cups live here," she'd said. "Not there. They chip when you move them too far." It had sounded like superstition at the time. Marianne checked the back door. Locked. The windows above the sink were closed tight, rain streaking down the glass in uneven lines. She stood alone in the kitchen, heart beating a little faster than it should have. "It's fine," she murmured, though the words felt thin in the air. "You forgot. You must have done it earlier." But she knew she hadn't. She was meticulous in her own way, tired, but never careless. And she distinctly remembered leaving the dishes where they were, promising herself she'd deal with them in the morning. She turned to go back upstairs. The drawer slid open behind her. Not fast, not all the way, just enough for the sound of wood on wood to register. Marianne froze. Slowly, she turned. The cutlery drawer had been pulled out a few inches. Inside, the knives had been rearranged. She had left them blade up in the divider habit from long shifts, quicker to grab. Now, every knife lay blade down, handles aligned, edges hidden. Marianne's throat went dry. She closed the drawer carefully and stood there for a long moment, listening. The rain continued its steady percussion outside. The house breathed around her, old and quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no explanation. She returned upstairs and lay awake until dawn. At 2:13 the following night, the kitchen corrected her again. This time, it was a mug. She'd placed it in the wrong cabinet high shelf, left side, simply because she hadn't felt like bending down. At 2:13, she woke to the sound of porcelain sliding. When she went downstairs, the mug was gone. In its place, a different cup sat on the counter, the one Mrs. Sterling used every morning. Plain white, hairline crack along the rim. Beside it, the cabinet door she'd used stood open, empty and expectant. Marianne closed it with shaking hands. On the third night, she stayed awake. She sat at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a blanket, watching the darkness below. The clock ticked toward the hour with infuriating calm. 2:12. The rain intensified, drumming harder against the roof. 2:13. The kitchen came alive, not violently, not all at once. A plate slid across the counter. A fork turned itself around with a soft metallic click. A cupboard opened, paused, then closed more firmly than before. Marianne hugged the blanket tighter around herself, pulse thudding in her ears. She realized, with a chill that settled deep in her chest, that the house wasn't angry. It was correcting her, and it was getting better at it. Marianne began adjusting her behavior without realizing she was doing it. It started small, unconscious. A plate placed more carefully. A spoon aligned instead of dropped into the drawer at an angle. She told herself it was habit. Years of hospital work had trained her to reduce friction, to move efficiently through shared spaces. Still, the kitchen noticed when she slipped. The corrections came quietly, almost politely. A cabinet door she hadn't fully closed would be shut by morning. A towel hung crooked over the oven handle would be folded, squared, returned to its hook. The sound always arrived at 2:13 Never earlier, never later, as if the house waited for confirmation that the day was truly over before it intervened. Marianne stopped setting alarms. She didn't need them. Her body learned the hour instinctively, waking moments before the clock changed, heart already beating faster in anticipation. She never caught the kitchen in the act. No matter how still she lay, no matter how carefully she listened, the sounds always seemed to begin just after she shifted her weight, just after she turned her head, just after her attention wavered, always behind her. One afternoon, while taking the trash out, she met Leo. He was sitting on the wet steps of the neighboring unit, hood pulled low, rain darkening the shoulders of his jacket. A small plastic dinosaur lay on the ground beside him, carefully positioned so its feet were flat, tail not touching the concrete. Marianne smiled despite herself. "You're going to drown that thing," Leo shrugged. "He doesn't like puddles." She paused. "You know what he likes?" Leo looked up at her then, eyes serious in a way that didn't quite fit his age. "Some things do." Marianne hesitated, then asked, "Do you hear noises at night?" Leo nodded immediately. "In your kitchen?" She pressed. Another nod. Smaller this time, more cautious. "My mom says it's the house settling," he said, "but she doesn't live on your side." Something about the way he said it, your side, made Marianne's stomach tighten. "What does it sound like?" she asked. Leo considered this. "Like when you fixed something that wasn't right." That night, Marianne tested the house. She left a spoon in the sink, angled awkwardly across the basin instead of lying flat. She set a plate upside down on the counter, off-center, its rim just barely overhanging the edge. She turned one mug so its handle faced inward, toward the wall. She did not feel brave. She felt resentful. At 2:13, the kitchen answered. The sounds were louder this time. Sharper, not violent, but emphatic. The spoon struck the side of the sink once tapped before sliding into the drying rack with a deliberate scrape. The plate was lifted and set down properly, the contact firm enough to make the counter shudder faintly. Then came the knocking, 3 short raps from inside the wall behind the cabinets. Not random, not exploratory, a warning. Marianne sat upright in bed, breath shallow, listening as the house settled back into stillness. Her pulse raced long after the last sound faded. In the morning, everything was perfect, too perfect. The spoon gleamed. The plate sat centered. The mug's handle faced outward, aligned precisely with the others. Even the dish towel had been folded again, edges crisp, corners exact. Marianne felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It was easier, she realized. When the kitchen approved, she cooked less, ate more simply, cleaned immediately after meals. When she followed what she now thought of as the old rules, the house was quiet, warm, even. The rain seemed softer on those nights. The silence more complete. It was only when she deviated, when she came home exhausted, hands shaking from a double shift, and set something down without thinking, that the kitchen responded. Faster now. Once, she turned her back for less than a minute and heard the scrape of a chair being nudged back into place behind her. She didn't turn around. She learned not to. Another afternoon, she found Leo again, this time crouched near the base of the duplex, lining up pebbles along the foundation. Each stone was spaced evenly, arranged with meticulous care. "Why are you doing that?" she asked gently. Leo didn't look up. "So it doesn't get mad." Marianne swallowed. "What gets mad?" "The house," he said, as if the answer were obvious. "It doesn't like messes. Or leaving." That night, she dreamed of Mrs. Sterling for the first time, not as a person, but as a presence, hands correcting her grip on a plate, fingers tapping twice on the counter when something was out of place. The dream had no dialogue, only instruction. When Marianne woke, she found herself standing in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile. The clock read 2:14. The sink was dry. The dish towel was folded, and on the counter, beside the familiar white mug with the hairline crack, sat an extra place setting, waiting. Marianne began to notice the pauses. They weren't long, just fractions of a second, barely enough to register as interruptions, but they appeared everywhere. In the space between lifting a plate and setting it down, in the moment after opening a cabinet before choosing where to reach, the kitchen waited for her to decide, and when she chose wrong, it corrected her. She could feel it most clearly when she cooked. She would chop vegetables at the counter, knife moving in a steady rhythm, and sense something behind her, not a presence, exactly, but an expectation. The air tightened slightly, as if the room itself were holding still, watching the angle of her wrist, the spacing of the cuts. Once, she turned to grab salt and heard the faintest sound behind her, a dry scrape, like ceramic adjusting against stone. When she turned back, the cutting board had shifted, not far, just enough to be square with the counter's edge. Marianne stood very still, life suspended midair, heart beating in her throat. "I was going to fix that," she said aloud, immediately hating the way her voice sounded thin, defensive. The kitchen said nothing, but the pressure did not ease. She adjusted the board. The air relaxed. She exhaled without realizing she'd been holding her breath. From then on, the house didn't need to act as often. Marianne anticipated the corrections before they happened. She aligned things instinctively. She wiped counters twice, once for cleanliness and once for symmetry. She placed items down and then nudged them slightly, testing the space until the room felt satisfied. The sound at 2:13 became softer. Approval, she thought, and the realization made her nauseous. She stopped inviting people over. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. She simply found reasons not to. The kitchen was too small. The house too old. She was too tired. The truth was harder to admit. Other people moved incorrectly. They opened drawers too far. They left cabinets ajar. They set cups down without regard for alignment or sequence. Marianne found herself watching them too closely, anxiety spiking with every careless gesture. Once, when a coworker came by unexpectedly, Marianne nearly cried when the woman placed her coffee mug in the sink instead of rinsing it first. The kitchen was silent that night. But the next morning, Marianne found the mug cracked cleanly down the side, split as if by pressure rather than impact. She apologized out loud while throwing it away. The habit frightened her enough that she locked herself in the bathroom afterward, hands trembling. Leo noticed the changes. "You stand different now," he said one afternoon, watching her from the bottom of the steps. Marianne glanced down at herself. "What do you mean? You don't lean," Leo said. "You stay straight." "Why?" She laughed weakly. "That's just good posture." Leo shook his head. "No. It likes when you don't lean." The rain fell steadily around them, soaking into the ground. Leo's dinosaur sat on the step beside him, positioned carefully away from the edge. "Does it ever let you go?" Marianne asked quietly. Leo considered this for a long time. "It lets you sleep," he said finally, "as long as you don't leave." That night, Marianne tried to break the pattern. She waited until just before 2:13 and deliberately left the kitchen messy. Not wildly, she couldn't bring herself to do that, but wrong enough. A fork out of place, a bowl left on the counter instead of stacked. She went upstairs and stood at the top of the stairs, heart pounding, watching the darkness below. The clock changed. 2:13. The kitchen did not begin gently this time. The first sound was a sharp knock from inside the wall, hard enough to vibrate the banister beneath Marianne's hand. Then another, Faster. Insistent. A drawer slammed shut. A plate rattled, skidding slightly before being righted with a force that made the counter thump against the wall. Marianne backed away, breath shallow, pulse roaring in her ears. "Stop," she whispered. "I'll fix it." The knocking continued. Faster now. Not a warning anymore. A reprimand. Marianne rushed downstairs, hands shaking, and corrected everything herself, aligning, stacking, wiping, adjusting, until the room stilled once more. Only then did the sound cease. She leaned against the counter, chest heaving, feeling something settle into place inside her. That night, she dreamed she was standing in the kitchen, hands folded just so, watching herself from the doorway. The version of her at the counter moved with perfect efficiency, never hesitating, never needing correction. Mrs. Sterling stood beside her, not touching, not speaking, just watching. When Marianne woke, she found her feet on the kitchen tile, bare, cold. She stood exactly where Mrs. Sterling used to stand every morning, facing the sink. Her posture was perfect. And somewhere inside the walls, something finished adjusting. The first time Marianne noticed the time restriction, it arrived disguised as comfort. She had come home late, too late, after covering an extra shift for a coworker who'd called in sick. The rain had intensified into a steady downpour, the kind that soaked through clothing and mood alike. By the time she unlocked the door, her shoulders ached and her hands trembled faintly with exhaustion. The clock above the microwave read 10:04 p.m. The kitchen light flicked on as soon as she stepped inside. Marianne paused, keys still in her hand. She hadn't touched the switch. The room glowed warmly, brighter than usual, the yellow light smoothing the edges of cabinets and counters, making everything look gentler, welcoming. The air smelled faintly of soap and something else, clean linen, maybe. Home. Her breath slowed. She set her bag down carefully, exactly where it belonged now, and peeled off her wet jacket. The moment the fabric touched the back of the chair, it slid just a little until it hung straight, not dripping onto the floor. Marianne swallowed. "I'm home," she said, unsure why she felt the need to announce it. The kitchen remained silent, but the warmth stayed. She made tea without incident. The kettle heated at the correct pace. The mug, the cracked white one, waited in its place. When she sat at the small table, the chair nudged itself forward an inch, aligning her posture with the edge. It was the easiest night she'd had in weeks. At 10:22, when she stood to check the mail, the front door did not open. Not locked. Not stuck. It simply resisted. Marianne pulled again. Harder this time. The handle turned fully. The latch released. The door did not move. A soft sound came from the kitchen wall behind her. Tap, tap, not a knock, a reminder. Marianne let go of the handle slowly. Her heart beat faster, but not wildly. Not yet. "I just wanted the mail," she said quietly. The kitchen light dimmed slightly. Not threatening, disapproving. She returned to the table and sat down. The warmth returned. From that night on, the rule clarified itself. After 10, the house closed. Not abruptly, not cruelly. The door would still open, earlier in the evening, but as the minutes crept past the hour, the resistance grew firmer, more absolute. By 10:15, it took effort. By 10:30, it was impossible. Marianne tested it only once more. At 10:47, she tried to step onto the porch. The air in the doorway thickened. Her breath stalled halfway through an inhale, lungs refusing to complete the motion. Panic flared, sharp and sudden, until she stumbled back inside, gasping. The door closed behind her on its own. The kitchen light warmed. She did not try again. The discovery of the notebook came accidentally. Marianne was wiping down the backsplash one afternoon, methodical and careful, when her cloth caught on something uneven. The tile shifted under pressure, revealing a thin seam she'd never noticed before. She froze. Slowly, she pressed again. The tile slid aside with a soft click. Behind it was a narrow cavity in the wall. Inside sat a notebook. The cover was warped with age, edges darkened as if from frequent handling. Housekeeping rules. It read, written in a firm, narrow hand, Mrs. Sterling's. Marianne's fingers shook as she opened it. The pages were filled front to back, the handwriting growing denser, more frantic as the notebook progressed. Lists, diagrams, corrections, acceptable placement, cups face outward, knives, blade down dive, towels folded in thirds, unacceptable behavior, leaving residue overnight, guests who do not rinse, objects left unattended. Then, further in, the tone shifted. Consequences. Repeated error requires reinforcement numb. Noise increases compliance and breakage discourages carelessness. Marianne's mouth went dry. Near the back, the writing pressed harder into the paper. Lines overlapping. Those who disrupt the kitchen must be taught. Those who stay will learn. Those who leave take disorder with them. The final entry was dated 3 days before Mrs. Sterling's death. After 10, the house rests. Those who belong do not wander. Marianne closed the notebook slowly. The kitchen felt very close around her. That evening, Leo knocked softly at her door just before sunset. He stood with his dinosaur tucked under one arm, rain dripping from his hood. "My mom says you don't come out anymore," he said. Marianne smiled, the expression stiff on her face. "I've been busy." Leo glanced past her, into the kitchen. His shoulders relaxed almost immediately. "It likes you," he said. The words settled heavily in her chest. That night, Marianne sat at the table, tea untouched, notebook open beside her. The clock ticked toward 10, with mechanical patience. When it passed the hour, nothing dramatic happened. The door simply became something she no longer considered. The kitchen hummed softly, the sound barely audible beneath the rain. Warm, orderly, complete. Marianne traced the rim of the empty bowl in front of her, finger following the curve. She understood then. The house didn't want silence. It wanted continuity, and it had almost finished teaching her. Marianne stopped trying to win. The realization came quietly, without panic or despair. It arrived the way exhaustion does after too many small adjustments, too many careful movements made to avoid consequence. One evening, as she stood at the sink wiping a bowl she hadn't used, she simply accepted that resistance required more energy than compliance. The kitchen did not react. It never reacted to acceptance. That night, instead of cleaning everything immediately, Marianne made a single, deliberate choice. She brewed tea, not because she wanted it, but because the kitchen expected a ritual at the end of the day. The kettle heated smoothly. The cracked white mug waited in its place. Steam curled upward, gentle and patient. When the tea was ready, Marianne poured it carefully, no spills, no drips, and then stopped. She did not drink it. She carried the mug to the counter and set it down beside the sink. Empty, clean, correctly placed. Then she went upstairs. At 2:13 a.m., the sound came, not sharp, not corrective, soft. A single ceramic touch, followed by the faintest scrape. The sound of a bowl being moved, not fixed, adjusted. When Marianne went downstairs in the morning, the mug was gone. In its place sat a small bowl, inverted, centered perfectly on the counter. Beneath it, the surface gleamed, cleaned, accepted. From then on, the arrangement held. Every night, Marianne left an empty bowl or cup on the counter. Never dirty, never misplaced, just waiting. At 2:13, the kitchen completed the ritual. She woke each morning to a spotless sink, a folded towel, and a subtle sense of approval that settled into her bones like warmth. The knocking stopped. The correction ceased. The house became gentle. The rain outside seemed quieter, less insistent. The nights grew predictable. Marianne slept deeply for the first time since moving in. Her dreams free of instruction, free of watching eyes. But the rule after 10 never loosened. Marianne learned its shape fully when Leo came knocking one evening at 9:58. Dinosaur tucked under his arm, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "Can I stay a bit?" he asked. "My mom's working late." Marianne glanced at the clock. 9:59. She hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "Of course." Lake's wife. Leo entered the kitchen and relaxed immediately, shoulders dropping, gaze drifting toward the counter. "It's nice in here," he said. "It's calm." Marianne smiled faintly. At 10:01, Leo stood and went to the door. "It's time," he said matter-of-factly. Marianne followed him. The door opened easily for Leo. He stepped onto the porch, then turned back. "You can't come with me." "I know," Marianne said. Leo nodded, satisfied. "It's okay. You're where you belong." The door closed gently behind him. The kitchen light warmed. Marianne did not cry. She returned to the counter and rinsed the bowl from the night before, drying it carefully before setting it out again. The motion felt natural now. Correct. Sometimes, late in the evening, she would stand by the window and watch the rain streak down the glass, imagining movement beyond it. Cars passing, people coming home, lives continuing without regard for alignment or sequence. She never tried the door again. She did not need to. At 2:13, the kitchen always moved. Not urgently, not impatiently, just enough to remind her that something was awake when she was not. Something that noticed what she left behind. Something that finished what she could not. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the rain softened and the house settled, Marianne sometimes felt it then, the gentle, enclosing certainty of a place that would never abandon her. A place that would never let her wander. The kitchen stayed immaculate. The routine remained intact. And every night, something waited on the counter empty, correct, and ready to be taken care of. The little shrine at mile marker 9. Gideon did not remember losing control of the truck. What he remembered instead was the moment before the precise instant, when his foot eased off the accelerator without conscious thought. No warning light, no Animal Crossing, just an inexplicable certainty that the curve ahead required less speed than he'd been giving it. The tires still screamed when they hit the loose gravel. The truck fishtailed, sliding toward the guardrail that had been bent and replaced more times than anyone cared to count. Gideon's hands locked around the wheel, heart hammering as the headlights swept briefly across the embankment and the place beyond it, where the land dropped away sharply into trees and rock. Then the truck stopped, not gently, not cleanly, but upright. The engine stalled. The world went very quiet. Gideon sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, the smell of hot rubber and dust filling the cab. Rain pattered lightly against the windshield, fine and persistent, blurring the view of the road ahead. Mile marker 9 stood just beyond the curve, white, crooked, scarred with old dents and chipped paint. Someone had painted the number on again and again over the years, each layer visible beneath the last, like tally marks that refused to fade. Gideon swallowed and turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. Later, much later, he would tell Martha that the strange thing wasn't how close he'd come to the edge. It was the certainty that something had already been standing there, waiting for him to slow down. That night, Gideon dreamed of the boundary stone. It was larger in the dream, weathered smooth by time and touch, sitting just off the road where the gravel gave way to packed dirt. An old man sat atop it, posture straight despite the years etched into his frame. He wore a coat that did not move with the wind. "You came through too fast," the old man said. Gideon tried to answer, but his mouth felt full of dust. He could hear the distant sound of engines passing, tires hissing over wet asphalt, each one a little too close. "I can keep them from crossing," the old man continued, gaze fixed on the curve. "But I need a place to stand." Gideon followed the man's eyes. The road shimmered faintly, like heat haze, though the air was cold. The line between asphalt and earth felt thinner here, stretched, uncertain. "What kind of place?" Gideon asked. The old man smiled, not kindly, but not cruelly either. "A remembered one," he said. "A polite one." When Gideon woke, dawn was just beginning to thin the darkness. Martha lay beside him, breathing evenly, unaware of how close the night had come to taking something it wasn't owed. Gideon did not tell her about the dream right away. Instead, he drove back to mile marker 9 that morning, parked carefully off the shoulder, and stood looking at the curve. In daylight, it looked ordinary enough, just another bend in a rural road that locals knew to respect and outsiders underestimated. Still, the air felt watched. He noticed then the small scatter of debris at the base of the marker, empty bottles, candy wrappers, a flattened fast food bag, all caught against the weeds by the rain. Gideon frowned, without quite knowing why. He gathered the trash and carried it back to his truck. At home, Martha listened quietly as he finally told her everything. The near miss, the dream, the old man on the stone. She did not laugh. Instead, she stirred her coffee slowly and said, "My grandmother used to say some roads have wardens." Gideon looked up. "Wardens? Not ghosts?" Martha said. "Not exactly. More like watchers. They keep things where they belong, as long as you're respectful." They built the shrine that afternoon. Nothing elaborate. Just a flat stone pulled from the field, set near the marker where the ground felt solid. A small bell hung from a simple wooden frame. Martha placed a jar beside it, empty except for a few coins to keep it from blowing over. When Gideon stepped back, the curve looked different, defined. That night, the bell rang once, and there was no wind. From then on, the accidents stopped, at least the serious ones. But other things began to happen. A man who threw his coffee cup out the window blew a tire less than a mile later. A truck that roared past without slowing stalled dead in the middle of the curve, engine refusing to turn over until the driver stepped out and muttered a shaky apology toward the stone. At night, Gideon lay awake, listening. Sometimes, just after midnight, he heard footsteps along the fence line. Slow, even, like someone making rounds. And sometimes, from far down the road, he heard the bell ring once, twice, marking passage, marking respect, marking the boundary that, once acknowledged, allowed you to pass. The name came to Gideon gradually. No one announced it. No voice leaned in to whisper. It surfaced the way old things often did in that part of the country, through repetition, through habit, through people speaking as if the listener already knew. Malachi. Martha said it first, offhand, while shelling peas at the kitchen table. Old Malachi used to sit by the road, she murmured, eyes on her hands, before the county paved it, before the curve sharpened. Gideon looked up. "You knew him?" She shook her head. No one knew him. They acknowledged him. That word lodged in Gideon's chest and stayed there. Acknowledged. From then on, the shrine was no longer something they had built. It was something they maintained. Gideon stopped there every morning on his way to the fields. He checked the stone to make sure it hadn't shifted, brushed away leaves, straightened the bell if it had twisted overnight. The bell itself felt heavier than it should have been, its metal cool even in sunlight, resistant to warmth. Sometimes, when he touched it, he had the distinct sense of being counted. The rules made themselves clear quickly. Slow down, say something, don't leave a mess. The locals adapted without complaint. Folks rolled their windows down just enough to murmur a greeting. Some tipped their hats. A few rang the bell lightly, once, respectful and brief. Outsiders took longer. Gideon learned to recognize them by sound before sight, the way their engines carried speed into the curve, the lack of hesitation, the impatience baked into their driving. When those cars passed, the air around the marker tightened, as if bracing. The consequences were never dramatic. A sputter, a flat, an engine that refused to cooperate until the drivers stood by the road, rain soaking their clothes, and said something approximating courtesy. It wasn't punishment, it was correction. At night, the patrols became clearer. Gideon would wake to the sound of boots on gravel, not loud, not stealthy, purposeful. A steady circuit around the property line, then out toward the road, then back again. When he peered through the window, he never saw anyone, but the fence posts were always upright in the morning. The gates always latched. The line between road and field remained intact, unblurred by encroachment or neglect. Malachi was keeping watch. Sheriff Vance noticed the shrine a week later. He pulled up in his cruiser mid-morning, lights off, engine idling. He stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the stone, the bell, the small sign Martha had added in neat block letters. "Please slow down. Looks like a distraction," Vance said finally. Gideon chose his words carefully. "It's keeping folks safe," Vance snorted. Superstition doesn't belong on county roads. The bell rang once. No wind. Vance's jaw tightened. You hear that? Yes, Gideon said. That's the point. The sheriff leaned closer to the shrine, eyes narrowing. He reached out, flicked the bell with a finger harder than necessary. The sound echoed sharp and wrong, vibrating too long before settling. That night, the power went out across the valley, not gradually, not in pockets. All at once, the darkness pressed in heavy and absolute, swallowing the road, the fields, the house. Gideon stood on the porch, heart pounding, listening. The footsteps came sooner than usual, heavier, slower. They circled the house twice before stopping at the boundary fence. Gideon felt it then, a pressure like a line being tested, stretched to see if it would hold. Martha gripped his arm. The boundary's unsettled, she whispered. From the road, the bell rang. Once, twice. Not a warning, a summons. Gideon stepped off the porch and into the dark boots, sinking into wet earth. As he approached the marker, the air grew colder, thicker, as if the night itself were waiting for him to speak. I'll fix it, he said aloud, voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. It'll stand. The pressure eased. The footsteps resumed, lighter now, moving on. By morning, the power returned. Sheriff Vance's cruiser sat stalled at the curve, hood up, rain streaming down his windshield. He stood beside it, pale and shaken. Gideon did not gloat. He only nodded once and rang the bell softly. That afternoon, Vance left the shrine alone. But Gideon understood then what he had truly agreed to. Not protection, responsibility. The road would remain open, as long as someone remembered how to ask. The second outage lasted longer, not just an hour or two, like the first long enough to be inconvenient, but short enough to dismiss. This one stretched across the valley and refused to lift, as if the night had decided to stay and see what would happen next. By the third evening without power, the road felt different. Gideon noticed it first, by sound. Engines no longer flowed through the curve with their usual rhythm. Cars slowed too early or too late, braking in short, nervous bursts. Tires hissed against wet asphalt, uncertain. The bell rang more often now, sometimes twice, in quick succession, sometimes once with a hollow note that lingered longer than it should have. Martha stopped leaving the porch light on. There was no point. They ate by lantern light, the rain drumming steadily on the tin awning. Beyond the fields, the road disappeared into a thickness that wasn't quite fog, and wasn't quite darkness either. Gideon had the uneasy sense that if he stepped too far into it, he might not come back out where he expected. You feel that? Martha asked quietly. He nodded. Like the edge moved. That night, the footsteps did not circle politely. They crossed. Gideon woke to the sound of boots on gravel inside the yard, slow, deliberate, heavier than before. Each step pressed into the earth with intention, testing ground that had always known where it belonged. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The steps moved along the fence line, paused, then continued straight through the open gate. Gideon knew he had latched before bed. Martha reached for his hand. The boundary's not holding, she whispered. Gideon pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch, lantern raised. The rain soaked his sleeves instantly, cold and insistent. The yard looked the same as it always had, muddy, uneven, familiar, but the feeling was wrong. The air felt shared now, as if the space between road and field no longer belonged exclusively to either. He walked toward the marker. Halfway there, he heard a voice not close, not distant, but positioned exactly where the curve bent out of sight. You let them rush me, it said. Malachi did not appear. The voice came from the space itself, from the place where asphalt met gravel, where countless tires had cut the same arc over the years. They don't stop, Gideon said, breath fogging in the lantern light. They don't listen. That's what the shrine is for, Malachi replied. It's not a charm. It's a courtesy. The bell rang behind Gideon, not from the marker, from the yard. Gideon turned sharply. The small bell by the stone was swaying, though there was still no wind. The sound it made now was lower, strained, as if the metal itself were tired of repeating the same request. "Someone's been touching it," Gideon said. "Yes," Malachi replied. Without asking, Sheriff Vance's presence announced itself the following morning with the crunch of tires and the low murmur of an idling engine. He stepped out of the cruiser looking older than Gideon remembered, jaw set hard, eyes shadowed. He did not look at the shrine at first. "I'm taking it down," Vance said flatly. "Tonight." Gideon felt the weight of the words before he understood them. "It's not yours," Gideon said carefully. "It doesn't belong to. It's on county land," Vance snapped. "And people are driving scared because of it." The bell rang once. Vance flinched, then recovered. "See? Distraction. You don't ring it like that," Gideon said. "You acknowledge it." Vance laughed, short and humorless. "I don't acknowledge roads. I enforce them." That afternoon, the outages spread. Phones lost signal. Radios hissed with static. A delivery truck stalled sideways across the curve, blocking it entirely until 4 locals pushed it clear, muttering apologies toward the stone as they worked. At dusk, the sky lowered until it felt close enough to touch. Gideon stood by the shrine, lantern in hand, when the first patrol reached the edge of the fields. This time, he saw them, not clearly. Never clearly. Shadows moved where shadows shouldn't, their outlines suggested by absence rather than form. Each step pressed the grass flat, left an imprint that lingered too long before springing back. "Boundaries are agreements," Malachi said, voice close now. "When you tear one down, something else has to decide where things stop." The bell rang again. Sheriff Vance's cruiser appeared at the far end of the road, headlights cutting through the rain. He parked hard and stepped out, crowbar in hand. "Enough," he shouted over the weather. "This ends now." The shadows paused. The air thickened. Gideon took a step forward. "Vance, say hello. Just say it." Vance sneered. "To a pile of rocks?" He swung the crowbar. The bell screamed. Not rang, screamed a sound that bent the rain around it, a note that carried down the road and into the fields, into places where direction still mattered. The lights went out everywhere at once. In the dark, footsteps surged, heavy, numerous, encircling. Martha screamed from the porch. Gideon dropped the lantern and ran. When the lights went out, the road lost its memory. That was the first thing Gideon understood as he ran toward the house, rain slapping hard against his face, boots slipping on ground that no longer felt reliably solid. The familiar slope of the yard seemed subtly wrong, too shallow in places, too steep in others, like a map that had been folded incorrectly and never quite smoothed out again. The darkness was complete. Not the gentle absence of light, but a thick, swallowing black that pressed close to the skin. Gideon could not see the porch until he collided with it, hands slamming against wood slick with rain. "Martha!" he shouted. Her voice answered immediately, sharp with fear. Inside, he stumbled through the door just as something passed across the yard. Not ran, not walked, crossed. The sound was unmistakable now, multiple sets of boots on gravel, heavy and deliberate, moving without hesitation through space that had once been clearly divided. The fence creaked, posts groaning under pressure they were never meant to bear. Martha bolted the door with shaking hands. The house groaned in response, beams flexing as if unsure which side of the boundary it occupied anymore. Outside, the footsteps spread, encircling. "They're not just on the road," Martha whispered. "They're everywhere." Gideon pressed his back to the door, breath coming fast. In the dark, he could feel the shape of the house more clearly than he could see it. The way its walls resisted the night, the way its foundation held to the earth by habit more than certainty. Then Malachi spoke, not from the road, not from the yard, from between. "This is what happens," the voice said, calm and inexorable. "When courtesy is removed." The words did not echo. They settled. Gideon closed his eyes. "You said the shrine was enough." "It is," Malachi replied. "When it stands." The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, too complete, too expectant. From somewhere beyond the house, metal scraped against stone. The sound of the crowbar, Vance. A pulse of pressure rolled through the night, strong enough to make the windows rattle in their frames. Martha cried out as the floorboards shuddered beneath them, dust raining down from the ceiling. Gideon forced the door open and stepped back into the dark. The rain had slackened, falling straight down now, heavy and cold. The yard looked distorted, stretched, as though distance itself were uncertain. He moved toward the marker by instinct alone. The shrine was barely visible, a darker shape against darker ground. Sheriff Vance stood beside it, crowbar raised again, his face pale and slick with rain. "You don't get to decide this," Vance shouted, though his voice wavered. "It's just a road." The ground shifted, not dramatically, not violently, but enough that Vance staggered, boots sliding on gravel that no longer lay flat. He windmilled, barely catching his balance, crowbar clattering from his hand. "Vance," Gideon said urgently. "Say hello. That's all. Just acknowledge him." I. Vance laughed a thin, brittle sound. "You're all out of your minds." The footsteps returned, closer now, heavier. They converged on the shrine, circling it in a tightening ring. Gideon could feel them more than see them, a gathering weight that pressed inward, testing the space for weakness. Malachi's voice lowered. "If the road has no warden," he said, "then it belongs to whatever takes it." Vance backed away from the stone, breath coming in short bursts. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This isn't..." The ground dipped sharply beneath his feet. Not a sinkhole, not a collapse, a misplacement. Vance fell hard, landing awkwardly on his side, the impact driving the breath from his lungs in a strangled gasp. He lay there, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, eyes wide with something that was no longer disbelief. Gideon knelt beside him. "Say it." Vance coughed, chest heaving. The footsteps paused, surrounding them completely now. "Say hello," Gideon repeated, softer this time. Vance swallowed. His gaze flicked to the shrine, to the bell hanging motionless in the rain, to the darkness pressing close from all sides. "Hello," he whispered. The word felt thin. The bell rang once. The sound rolled outward, not loud but certain, rippling through the darkness like a line being redrawn. The pressure eased slightly. The footsteps retreated a single pace. Malachi's presence settled, heavy but no longer advancing. "That's better," the voice said. The road exhaled. The ground beneath Gideon's knees firmed, regaining its familiar resistance. Distance began to make sense again. The curve reasserted itself, the boundary between asphalt and earth sharpening back into place. The power did not return immediately, but the road remembered what it was. Gideon helped Vance to his feet. The sheriff leaned heavily on him, shaken, humbled, eyes unfocused. "This isn't over," Vance muttered. "No," Gideon agreed. "But it's back where it belongs." The shrine stood intact. The bells swayed gently now, ringing once more softer than before. A reminder. They rebuilt the shrine at first light. No one made a ceremony of it. There were no prayers, no speeches, no attempt to explain what had happened the night before. The valley woke slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether the road would still be there when the fog lifted. Gideon worked with steady hands. He reset the stone where it had always belonged, tamped the gravel around its base until it held firm. Martha cleaned the bell carefully, wiping away rain and grit, polishing it until it caught the pale morning light. Sheriff Vance stood off to one side, silent, his uniform damp and rumpled, his usual authority noticeably diminished. When the shrine stood whole again, it looked ordinary. That was the most unsettling part. Just a stone, a bell, a small wooden sign Martha had painted sometime before noon, the letters neat and unadorned. "Say hello, then pass." Nothing else. No warnings, no threats, no explanation. The road accepted it immediately. Traffic returned cautiously at first. Locals slowed without being told, windows rolling down just enough to offer a word or a nod. Some rang the bell softly, others simply raised a hand. Eyes forward, respectful. Nothing happened to them. Outsiders learned quickly. The first driver who ignored the shrine stalled cleanly at the curve, engine cutting out without drama. He sat there for several minutes, confused, before stepping out into the drizzle and glancing around. "Hello?" he called, uncertain. The engine started again. By the end of the week, word had spread without ever being spoken aloud. People slowed. People greeted the road. People passed safely. Gideon still heard the patrols at night. They were quieter now. Lighter. The sound of boots no longer testing the ground, but confirming it. Making sure the line held. Making sure nothing crossed that hadn't been invited. Malachi did not speak again. He did not need to. Sometimes, when Gideon stood by the shrine at dusk, he felt the presence settle nearby, a weight on the air. The certainty that the boundary was being observed from the other side. Sheriff Vance never touched the shrine again. He drove past it slowly, window down, jaw tight. He never rang the bell. He did say hello, though. Each time, the word clipped but audible. It was enough. Years passed. The curve at mile marker 9 kept its reputation, but it changed in tone. People stopped calling it cursed. They called it particular. A place that required attention. A place where you acknowledged something older than speed limits and signage. Accidents became rare, non-existent. The road still demanded respect, and sometimes people refused to give it. But the land no longer reached so far when that happened. The consequences stayed contained, localized. Gideon grew older. Martha's hair silvered. The fields continued to produce, season after season, their boundaries unblurred and intact. And every night, just before turning in, Gideon would step onto the porch and listen. If the bell rang, it was once. If footsteps passed, they stayed where they belonged. If the wind moved through the curve, it carried no urgency, only order. Travelers who came through learned the rule quickly, even if they didn't understand it. They slowed. They greeted the place where the road bent, and the land insisted on being noticed. They passed through unharmed, and behind them, at mile marker 9, the little shrine remained, the station of courtesy, a toll paid in recognition, a reminder that some boundaries do not stop you. They simply ask to be acknowledged before you cross. Red tap on the 13th floor. Arthur had worked maintenance long enough to trust schematics. Old buildings lied in their own ways, walls thicker than expected, corridors that curved subtly off axis. But blueprints, at least, were supposed to agree with reality. They were the last line of sanity between what a structure was and what it had become. That was why the red valve bothered him. It wasn't marked on any plan. Arthur stood alone in the service corridor, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, staring at the pipework bolted along the concrete wall. Everything else followed a logic he recognized. Feed lines, return lines, pressure gauges dulled by decades of use. But halfway down the corridor, a valve jutted out at chest height, painted a deep, industrial red that looked newer than the rest of the system. Too new. A brass wheel. Heavy. The kind meant to be turned slowly, deliberately. A small metal tag hung beneath it, blank except for a single stamped character. 13. There was no 13th floor listed anywhere in the hospital. Arthur checked the clipboard again, then the corridor sign behind him. Technical Services Level C. No ward name, no public access. Just concrete, pipes, and the smell of disinfectant layered over something older metal, damp, and time. He keyed his radio. "Control, this is Arthur. I've got a valve on Level C that's not on the drawings." "No laying?" Static hissed softly before the reply came. "Red wheel?" the voice asked. Arthur paused. "Yes." A beat too long passed before Control answered. "Scheduled maintenance. 5 a.m. Only. That's in an hour," Arthur said, glancing at his watch. 3:57 a.m. "Correct," Control replied. "Do not touch it before then." The line went dead. Arthur stared at the valve again. Hospitals ran on rules layered over older rules, habits calcified into procedure. He had learned not to ask why certain things were done, only when. Still, something about the valve felt attentive, as if it had noticed him noticing it, at precisely 5 a.m. The pressure gauge beside the valve ticked upward. Arthur slipped on his gloves, the latex snapping softly against his wrists, and braced himself. The brass wheel resisted at first, stiff from disuse or intention, he couldn't tell which. Then it moved. The sound came immediately. Not a rush of water, not a hiss of steam. A voice, faint, distorted, traveling through metal and fluid, but unmistakably human. "Tell my wife." Arthur froze, one hand still on the wheel. The voice continued, layered with the low groan of pipes adjusting to new pressure. "I didn't mean to leave like this." Another voice joined it, overlapping, older, strained, cold. "So cold, please." Arthur released the valve instinctively. The wheel snapped back into place with a dull thunk, and the voices vanished as if someone had closed a door. The corridor fell silent except for the fluorescent hum. Arthur's heart hammered in his chest. He leaned back against the wall, breath shallow, trying to convince himself he had imagined it. Sound carried strangely through pipes. Water systems picked up vibrations. Old buildings remembered things, but his hands were shaking. He keyed the radio again. "Control." "I heard. We know," Control said calmly. "That's why it opens at 5. Arthur swallowed. "What is it?" Another pause. Shorter this time. He could hear the building through the line, the distant echo of trolleys. A muffled announcement far above. "Pressure relief," Control said, "for residual acoustic load." Arthur closed his eyes. "You're telling me the pipes talk?" "No," the voice replied. "They listen." "Leif." Arthur looked at the valve, at the red paint, the stamped number, the wheel waiting patiently to be turned again. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Until the gauge drops," Control said. "Then you close it." "Same as always." Arthur hesitated. "And if I don't?" The radio crackled softly. "Then it finds another way out." The line went silent. Arthur placed his hand back on the valve. The brass felt warm now. When he turned it again, the voices returned stronger this time. Not screaming. Not yet. Just speaking, overlapping, pressing forward with the insistence of words that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. "My name is Julian. Don't forget me. It hurts to stop breathing." Arthur's vision blurred as something unfamiliar brushed the inside of his mind. Images, sensations, fragments of lives compressed into pressure and sound. He did not understand the language that slipped from his lips, but he spoke it anyway. Arthur stopped drinking tap water at work. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, just a hesitation, his hand hovering over the paper cup before pulling back. The water still ran clear, still cold, still tasted the same, but once you knew what pressure could carry, it was difficult not to imagine other things moving with it. Voices, for instance. By the third morning, Arthur knew the routine as well as any maintenance task he'd ever been given. At 4:55 a.m., the gauge beside the red valve would twitch. At 5 precisely, it would rise. And if the valve was not opened, the pipes elsewhere in the building would begin to complain, knocking softly at first, then harder, as though something were testing for weakness. The hospital did not tolerate improvisation. Arthur arrived early now, checking the corridor twice before entering, as if the valve might move when unobserved. It never did. It waited. Dr. Holloway found him there on the 4th day. She stood at the far end of the corridor, clipboard tucked under one arm, her white coat buttoned higher than necessary. She did not look surprised to see him. "You're Arthur," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he replied. "You're Holloway," she said. "Pathology." Arthur frowned. "This isn't near pathology." "No," she agreed. "But it's adjacent to outcomes." "Why?" She walked closer, heels clicking softly against concrete, eyes flicking briefly to the red valve before returning to his face. "You heard them," she said. Arthur hesitated, then nodded. "I still do." Holloway's expression did not change. "That means the system's working." Arthur let out a short, humorless laugh. "You call that working?" She considered him for a moment. "Do you know what happened here in 1918? Arthur shook his head. The influenza ward was above this level, she said. Overflow patients, makeshift beds, not enough staff, not enough time. She paused. A great many last words were spoken into air that had nowhere to go. Arthur's chest tightened. And they ended up in the pipes? In the water, Holloway corrected gently. Sound is vibration. Vibration under pressure needs somewhere to dissipate. When it doesn't, it accumulates. Arthur stared at the valve. So this is a drain, a release, she said. The red tab prevents acoustic saturation from migrating upward. Without it, wards above begin to experience interference. What kind of interference? Arthur asked, though he already suspected the answer. Holloway closed her eyes briefly. Hallucinations, patients hearing voices that aren't theirs, staff responding to calls that were never made. She opened them again. Panic spreads faster than disease. The gauge ticked upward. Holloway stepped back instinctively. It's almost time. No. Arthur pulled on his gloves. Why 5 a.m.? Lowest occupancy of consciousness, she said. Most patients are sedated or asleep. Fewer ears open. Arthur swallowed. And me? Holloway met his gaze steadily. You're insulated. The word rang hollow. At 5 a.m. Arthur turned the valve. The sound rushed out this time, layered and dense, like a crowd speaking all at once in a language that refused to settle into meaning. The pipes vibrated beneath his hands, pressure surging through metal and bone alike. Arthur's breath hitched as fragments pressed into him, images of faces he had never seen, corridors he had never walked. The weight of blankets tucked too tightly around failing bodies. Words spilled from his mouth. Not English, not anything he recognized. Holloway stiffened. That's new. Arthur tried to stop speaking. His jaw moved anyway, shaping syllables that felt borrowed, his tongue remembering patterns his mind did not own. Galore, Frigus, ich bin noch hier. Holloway's eyes widened slightly. Latin, German. Arthur's knees buckled. He leaned hard against the wall, still gripping the valve, voice shifting again as the pressure found new channels. Please tell my mother. Holloway stepped forward. Close it. Arthur twisted the wheel back with all his strength. The voices cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence that pressed painfully against his ears. Arthur slid down the wall to the floor, gasping, lungs burning as if he'd surfaced too quickly from deep water. Holloway knelt beside him. You need to ground yourself, she said calmly. Drink something. Eat. Don't let the residue linger. Arthur laughed weakly. Residue. She didn't smile. It builds if you don't let it go. Arthur wiped his mouth with the back of his glove. How long has this been going on? Holloway stood. Longer than the building's been honest about. She gathered her clipboard and paused before leaving. If the main line ever fails, she added quietly, don't listen. Just close the valve. Arthur looked up at her. And if I can't? Holloway hesitated. Then, she said, you become part of the buffering system. She left him alone with the red valve and the slowly falling gauge. Arthur remained on the floor long after the pressure normalized, the echo of borrowed words still vibrating behind his teeth. Somewhere deep in the building, water settled, and something waited for 5 a.m. again. Arthur began to lose track of which words were his. It happened gradually, the way hearing loss does, not with a sudden silence, but with a subtle shift in emphasis. Certain sounds grew louder than others. Certain syllables clung to him after conversations ended, echoing faintly in the back of his mind like water trapped in a bend of pipe. By the end of the second week, he had stopped correcting himself when unfamiliar phrases slipped out. At first, they appeared only near the valve, short utterances under his breath, a muttered apology in a language he did not recognize, a whispered name spoken with certainty but no memory attached to it. Julian came later. Arthur heard the name before he understood it. It surfaced during the release, carried on a steady flow of overlapping voices that suddenly thinned, as though the system itself had made space. Julian Ward B, someone said clearly. Julian, breathe. Don't move him. Arthur's grip tightened on the valve wheel. The pressure gauge jumped higher than usual, needle trembling near the red zone. Holloway had warned him about this. Source convergence, she had called it, when one memory cluster outweighed the others and began to dominate the release. It happened occasionally with long-term patients, ones who had lingered, ones whose last moments had been stretched thin across hours, days, weeks. Julian had not wanted to leave. Arthur felt it immediately, not as emotion, but as insistence, a weight pressing forward, shaping the sound around it. I can hear you. Still cold. Don't turn it yet. Arthur's mouth opened. No, he said automatically, but the word came out wrong. 9. He closed his eyes, heart pounding, as Julian's voice threaded itself through the others clearer, closer, as though it were speaking directly into his ear. You're there every morning. Arthur's knees weakened. He leaned his shoulder into the wall, struggling to keep the valve steady. You listen when they won't. The pressure climbed again. Arthur felt it behind his eyes now. A deep, building ache that pulsed in time with the vibrating pipes. Images bled through white curtains fluttering without breeze, hands gripping metal bed rails, a ceiling light flickering just out of sync with breath. Julian's memories were not dramatic. They were enduring. Hours spent counting the drip of condensation from a pipe overhead, the sound of shoes passing without stopping, the way pain dulled into something almost manageable if one focused hard enough on routine. Arthur spoke again, voice slipping into a softer register. I'm here. This time, the words were English. The release shuddered. Holloway appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving faster than Arthur had ever seen her move. Arthur, she called sharply. Close it. Julian's voice surged. Don't. Please. Just a moment. Arthur's hands trembled. For a heartbeat, he understood exactly what was being asked. Not freedom, not rescue, but recognition. To be heard, fully, completely, without interruption. The gauge hit the red line. Arthur twisted the valve shut. The voices collapsed inward, with a sound like breath pulled too quickly from lungs. The pipes groaned in protest, then settled. Arthur slid down the wall, clutching his head as the pressure released violently, leaving behind a ringing emptiness that made him nauseous. Holloway reached him just as he retched, dry and painful. You can't talk back, she said urgently, crouching beside him. You can't respond. That's how it anchors. Arthur wiped his mouth with shaking hands. He knows me. Holloway didn't deny it. They all know someone. You're just close enough to hear. Arthur laughed weakly. Close enough. Donder Saul. Wait. She helped him to his feet. Julian died during the second surge, she said quietly. Respiratory failure. Conscious until the end. Arthur stared at the valve. So he's still pressurized, Holloway said, along with thousands of others. The building creaked softly, a sound Arthur now recognized as internal redistribution. Somewhere above them, water moved through old lines, carrying with it more than heat. That night, Arthur dreamed in fragments. He lay in a narrow bed, unable to turn his head, listening to water run somewhere just out of sight. He could feel the weight of blankets. The ache of breath resisted, the deep, irrational fear that if he slept, something essential would drain away. When he woke, his pillow was damp, not with sweat, with condensation. At work the next morning, the main pressure alarm was already sounding. Holloway met him at the corridor entrance, face pale. The primary line's cracked, she said. We're rerouting, but the load. Arthur looked past her, down the corridor where the red valve waited. How long until it fails? Holloway swallowed. Minutes. Arthur nodded slowly, a strange calm settling over him as the pressure inside the building climbed. Then, he said, voice steady despite the language's murmuring just beneath it, we don't have much time to listen. The alarm did not sound like an alarm anymore. It had flattened into a single, continuous tone, neither rising nor falling in auditory pressure that sat on Arthur's chest the moment he stepped back into the corridor. The lights flickered in an irregular pattern now, not failing outright, but struggling to maintain rhythm, as if the building itself were losing track of time. Water moved everywhere. Arthur could hear it clearly now. A low, omnipresent rushing behind the walls, above the ceiling, beneath the floor. It no longer followed the clean directional flow he'd learned to recognize. It circled, reversed, tested weak points with patient insistence. The main line had cracked behind the service wall 2 corridors over. Not burst. Not yet. Just enough to leak pressure into spaces never meant to hold it. Containment teams are evacuating the wards, Holloway said, walking beside him, voice raised to be heard over the groan of stressed metal. If the release migrates upward, Arthur nodded. He could finish the sentence without help. The voices would follow the water. They reached the red valve at 4:58 a.m. The gauge needle trembled violently now, slamming against the upper range with each surge. Hairline fractures had begun to spread across the glass face, branching outward like stress marks in ice. Arthur braced himself against the wall as the building shuddered. A new sound joined the others. Not speech, breathing. Thousands of breaths layered together, ragged, shallow, uneven, each one slightly out of sync with the next. The sound poured through the pipes, carried by pressure that had nowhere left to go. Arthur's vision swam. He tasted metal, old pennies, blood without the heat. "Don't open it yet," Holloway said sharply, reading the panic on his face. "If you open now, it won't stop." Arthur swallowed hard. "If I don't," a scream tore through the system. Not one voice, many. The sound was compressed, distorted, forced through narrow metal pathways that broke it into jagged pieces. It rattled the lights. It made Arthur drop to one knee. Hands clamped over his ears as the pressure drove inward. Images slammed into him. Beds packed too close together. Curtains tied back because there was no room to isolate. Hands clawing at sheets. Mouths opening. Closing. Opening again, no sound making it out. Arthur screamed too, but what came out of him was not his own voice. He spoke in a cascade of languages, each overlapping the last, words spilling out faster than his mouth could shape them. "Non lasci armi. Bit. Ik ken nicht. Je veux juste dormir." Holloway grabbed his shoulders, grounding him. "Arthur, look at me." He tried. The corridor warped, bending subtly inward, as if the walls were listening too. The pressure spike hit without warning. Somewhere above them, a pipe gave way completely. The sound was unmistakable, a wet, violent rupture, followed by the roar of released water and memory. The building cried out as the system lost containment, voices surging upward through every available channel. Arthur felt something tear loose inside his chest, not physically. Structurally, the distinction between what he heard and what he was collapsed. The memories no longer pressed at him from the outside. They flowed through him, using his breath, his throat, his pulse as conduits. Julian's voice rose above the others. "Too much, please." Arthur forced himself upright, staggering toward the valve as the corridor tilted. The brass wheel burned beneath his gloves now, heat radiating outward, as if the pressure itself were trying to keep him from touching it. "Arthur, don't listen," Holloway shouted, but he was already listening. He heard final jokes told to nurses who didn't have time to laugh. He heard apologies whispered into pillows. He heard names repeated until they lost meaning. He heard Julian say his name again. Arthur planted his feet and grabbed the wheel. The pressure slammed into him immediately, a physical force that bowed his back and drove the air from his lungs. Water sprayed from microfractures along the pipe, misting the corridor with cold droplets that carried the taste of old breath. Arthur screamed and turned the valve. The wheel fought him. The system resisted closure, every surge of pressure translating into a pulse of sound and memory that tried to push him back. His arms shook violently. His vision tunneled. Close. He gasped, teeth clenched. Anyway, the voices rose in one final, unified swell. A desperate, crushing wave that threatened to tear him open. Entirely. Arthur leaned into it. He remembered Holloway's words. "Don't listen." So he didn't. He stopped understanding. He turned the wheel without meaning, without language, without interpretation. Pure motion against force, muscle against pressure. Will stripped down to function. The valve slammed shut. The effect was immediate and brutal. The voices cut off mid-breath. The corridor rang with a deafening silence that hit Arthur like a physical blow. He collapsed to the floor as the pressure dropped violently, the pipes groaning in relief and pain. Water continued to rush elsewhere in the building, but here, at the red valve, the system held. Arthur lay gasping, lungs burning, throat raw, his body trembling uncontrollably as the residual noise drained away. The lights steadied. The alarm fell silent. Holloway knelt beside him, eyes wide, breath unsteady. "You did it," she said. Arthur did not answer. He was still listening, because even in the quiet, something remained. A faint, rhythmic tapping, deep within the walls, waiting. Arthur did not remember leaving the hospital. He remembered the quiet. Not silence, never silence, but a careful absence, like a room after something important had been removed and the air was still learning how to behave without it. The corridor lights held steady. The red valve remained closed. The gauge needle hovered obediently below the danger line, as if nothing had ever tried to overwhelm it. Dr. Holloway walked him to the lift and did not speak. There was nothing left that could be said without reopening something neither of them wanted to test. At street level, London carried on as it always did. Buses sighed at stops. A taxi honked somewhere down the road. Rain fell lightly, persistent but manageable. Arthur stood beneath the hospital awning for several minutes, breathing in air that did not press back. His mouth tasted clean. For the first time in weeks, no foreign syllables pressed against his teeth. No borrowed cadence lingered in his throat. He tested his voice quietly. Arthur. The name sounded like his again. At home, he showered longer than necessary, letting the water run hot until steam filled the small bathroom and fogged the mirror. The pipes in his flat rattled once when he turned the tap off, then settled. Normal. He slept deeply that night. No voices, no images, no pressure. Morning light crept through the curtains, pale and ordinary. Arthur woke with the strange, hollow relief of someone who had survived something too large to be grateful for yet. He made coffee. The kettle clicked off. The mug warmed his hands. Everything behaved exactly as it should. And then he heard it. Drip, pause, drip, drip. Arthur frowned and turned toward the sink. The kitchen tap was closed. Still, a single bead of water formed at the spout and fell into the basin with a soft, deliberate sound. Arthur waited. Drip, drip, pause. His chest tightened, not with fear, but recognition. He reached for a towel and wrapped it around the spout, twisting it gently. The dripping stopped for a moment, then the towel darkened. Water soaked through it slowly, precisely, each drop forcing its way out with quiet insistence. Arthur pulled the towel away and watched as the dripping resumed, unchanged. Drip, drip, pause, drip. Arthur leaned closer, heart beginning to race, not because of the sound itself, but because of the pattern. He counted without meaning to. Short, short, long. His breath caught. "No," he whispered. The dripping continued. Arthur stood very still, listening. Slowly, painfully, the pattern assembled itself in his mind, not as sound, but as structure. Then trice. And so, Bregnus dragged at. No, his name, spelled patiently, relentlessly, one drop at a time. Arthur backed away from the sink, pulse roaring in his ears. "You're closed," he said hoarsely. "You're sealed." The tap dripped again, this time. Faster, not shouting, calling. Arthur sank into the kitchen chair, hands pressed flat against his thighs, breathing carefully, evenly. The sound did not stop. It did not escalate. It simply continued. As if assured of his attention, he realized then what Holloway had meant. The system doesn't end. It reassigns. The hospital had needed a release point. Now, something else did. Arthur closed his eyes. He did not answer, but he listened, and somewhere, deep within the city's unseen arteries, pressure adjusted, grateful, patient, and newly aware that it had found someone who could hear. The fare you pay with a breath. The rain had turned the city into a single, continuous sound. Not a storm, not dramatic enough for that, but a steady, soaking persistence that blurred edges and dulled color. Streetlights smeared into pale halos on the pavement. Headlights passed like ghosts, their reflections stretching and breaking across puddles that never seemed to drain. Vesper stood beneath the shelter of the tram stop, collar pulled up, fingers numb around the strap of her bag. It was past midnight, the kind of hour when the city didn't sleep so much as exhale, loosening its grip on daylight rules. Her shift at the all-night copy shop had ended late, too late for comfort, too early for dawn, and the streets felt sparsely occupied, as though only those with unfinished business were still allowed outside. The night tram arrived without announcement, no electronic chime, no recorded voice, just the soft metallic sigh of brakes and the low hum of power settling into place. Its lights were dimmer than the others on the line, tinted faintly yellow, like old photographs left too long in the sun. Vesper hesitated. The display above the door was blank. Still, the door slid open. Inside, the carriage was warm. Not overheated, just enough to fog the edges of the windows and take the sting out of the rain. The seats were occupied, but sparsely. Passengers arranged with odd, deliberate spacing between them. They were all facing forward. No phones, no conversation, no movement beyond the gentle sway of the car. Vesper stepped inside. The doors closed with a sound too soft to be mechanical. The tram pulled away. Only then did she notice the conductor. He stood near the front, one hand resting lightly on a metal rail, posture relaxed in a way that suggested long familiarity with imbalance. His uniform was dark and outdated, the fabric worn smooth at the cuffs. A small badge caught the light briefly as he turned. The letters C. "Evening," he said pleasantly. Vesper nodded. "Evening." He smiled as though she'd passed a small test. "Tickets, please," he continued, voice mild, conversational. "Or the alternative." She frowned. "I don't have cash. I can tap." "Oh, we don't take money," he said gently. He raised one finger. "This tram accepts one thing only." "Lonesome." Vesper felt an inexplicable chill pass through her chest. "What thing?" she asked. The conductor's smile widened just enough to show teeth. "A breath." The word landed oddly in the air, not loud, not threatening, but weighted. The tram hummed beneath her feet, steady and patient, as though it already knew the answer. "I'm sorry," Vesper said. "What?" "One breath," the conductor repeated, still smiling. Exhaled, voluntarily. "That's the fare." "Morris." A laugh bubbled up in her throat and died there. The other passengers did not react. They sat motionless, eyes forward, hands folded in laps or resting loosely at their sides. "How much is that in normal terms?" Vesper asked. The conductor tilted his head. "That depends on how many you've got to spare." The tram passed through an intersection without slowing. Outside the window, Vesper glimpsed something wrong. The street they should have crossed was blocked, cars piled at odd angles, hazard lights blinking through rain and smoke. Emergency sirens wailed somewhere distant, stretched thin and frantic. But the tram did not stop. It slid through the space where the intersection should have been, the view outside smearing briefly, like water dragged across glass, before reforming into another stretch of track. Clear, empty, safe. Vesper's mouth went dry. She turned back to the conductor. "What line is this?" "The shortcut," he said simply. She swallowed. "Shortcut to where?" "Where you were already going," he replied. Without the trouble, the tram swayed gently as it picked up speed. Vesper glanced at the other passengers again. Up close, they looked diminished. Not sick, not injured, just quieter, somehow. Their mouths hung, slightly open, lips parted, as if in the middle of speech that had never quite arrived. A woman across the aisle caught Vesper's eye. She smiled. No sound came out. The conductor extended his hand, palm up, patient as the rain outside. "Well?" he asked. One breath. The tram slipped deeper into the night, and the city outside began to rearrange itself. Vesper did not give the breath right away. She stood near the doors, fingers curled around the strap of her bag, watching the rain trace slow, uneven paths down the glass. The tram hummed beneath her shoes, a low, steady vibration that seemed to travel upward through her legs and settle somewhere behind her ribs. Outside, the city slid past in fragments, A bridge she crossed every week appeared ahead, then did not. Instead of the familiar curve of concrete and sodium lights, the window showed a twisted lattice of metal and flashing blue, an accident frozen mid-chaos. Cars stacked at impossible angles, a bus jackknifed across lanes it should never have reached. Figures moved through rain and smoke, small and frantic. The tram did not slow. It passed through the scene the way a finger passes through steam, the image smearing, thinning, then clearing into an empty stretch of track beyond. Vesper's breath caught in her chest. "This isn't possible," she said. The conductor, Mr. C, shifted his weight slightly, as if acknowledging a mild inconvenience. "It's efficient." She turned on him. "People are." Her voice faltered. "They're dying." "Yes," he said easily. On the main route, the tram rocked gently as it entered a tunnel Vesper had never seen before. Its walls were close and wet, the sound of rain amplified into a hollow roar. The lights dimmed further, throwing long shadows that stretched and merged across the floor. "And this?" she asked. "What happens here?" Mr. C gestured down the carriage. "People arrive." Vesper looked again at the passengers. There were more of them now, she realized. Or perhaps she was only noticing them properly. A man with a courier bag sat rigidly upright, eyes fixed on the door at the front. A teenager slouched with headphones around his neck, mouth slightly open, chest rising and falling shallowly. An elderly woman clasped a handbag to her chest, lips moving soundlessly as if rehearsing something she could no longer say. Their voices, if they had once had them, were thinning. She stepped closer to the woman with the handbag. "Are you okay?" The woman turned her head slowly. Her eyes were alert, aware. She opened her mouth. Air moved. No sound followed. The woman's expression tightened not in pain, but in frustration, like someone discovering a familiar tool no longer worked the way it used to. She raised one hand and pressed two fingers lightly to her throat, then shook her head. Mr. C watched the exchange with polite interest. "How many stops?" Vesper asked him quietly. "That depends," he said, "on how many times you ride." She frowned. "You mean, how many breaths?" He nodded. Vesper swallowed. The air in the tram felt warm, heavy with humidity and something else, an impression of being inside a lung rather than a vehicle. Each inhale felt noticeable now, deliberate. "What happens if I don't pay?" she asked. Mr. C's smile softened. "Then you disembark at the next available alignment." "And where is that?" The tram burst briefly back into open air. Outside the window, Vesper saw her street, or what remained of it. The copy shop sign hung at a crooked angle, flickering weakly. The pavement was torn open near the corner, water pouring into a sinkhole that swallowed light and sound alike. Sirens wailed nearby, closer than before. The tram slid past the devastation without pause. Vesper's heart pounded. She turned back to Mr. C. "One breath," she said hoarsely. "That's all?" "For this segment," he replied. She closed her eyes. It felt foolish dramatic to hesitate over something so small. She breathed thousands of times a day without thinking. What was one more? Vesper exhaled, not sharply, not deeply, just enough to feel the air leave her lungs. The tram shuddered, almost imperceptibly. Mr. C inclined his head. "Thank you." A faint dizziness washed over her, like standing up too quickly. Her chest felt lighter, not empty, just less anchored. She tested her voice. "Okay?" The word came out thinner than she expected. Still audible, still hers, but the edge of it frayed slightly, as if it had traveled farther than it should have to reach her ears. The tram continued on. More scenes slipped by the windows, fires, collisions. Crowds pressed too tightly together under flashing lights, each one blurred as the tram passed through the place where disaster was, emerging into a stretch of track where nothing had happened yet, or ever would. Vesper sank into an empty seat, pulse racing. Across the aisle, the courier bagman met her eyes. He raised a hand slightly in greeting. When he tried to speak, only a breath escaped, long and soft, like wind passing through a narrow gap. Mr. C moved down the aisle, checking on passengers with the ease of someone accustomed to diminishing returns. "Comfortable?" he asked Vesper. She nodded, then hesitated. How many breaths does it usually take? Mr. C considered this. Enough. The tram entered another tunnel, longer this time. The lights flickered, and Vesper felt a pressure change, subtle but insistent, like descending in an elevator too quickly. Her throat felt dry. When she swallowed, the sound echoed inside her head, delayed by a fraction of a second. Vesper leaned back against the seat. Rain and darkness sliding endlessly past the windows. She realized, with a quiet, creeping dread, that she could no longer hear the passengers breathe. Only the tram, only the track. And somewhere ahead, another stretch of safety waiting to be paid for. The first thing Vesper lost was projection. She noticed it when she tried to say "excuse me," and the words failed to travel more than a few feet. They left her mouth obediently enough, but arrived weakened, as if they had taken a long detour before reaching the air. She cleared her throat. The sound came out soft and papery. Mr. C glanced over from the front of the carriage, one eyebrow lifting in gentle acknowledgement, like a maitre d' who had seen this many times before. Adjustment period, he said. Perfectly normal. The tram swayed into another curve. Outside, rain sheeted down the windows in diagonal lines that seemed to pull the city backward. Inside, the air felt denser, humid in a way that clung to the back of the throat. Vesper leaned forward, elbows on knees, counting her breaths without meaning to. Each inhale felt shorter than the last, not panicked, not painful, just incomplete, as though the end of each breath had been quietly filed away. She stood and walked the length of the carriage. The passengers watched her approach with expressions that were not quite hopeful and not quite resigned, faces caught in the moment before decision finishes settling. When she reached the teenager with the headphones, she gestured to them. Can you? She stopped. Tried again. Do you hear anything? The boy lifted one cup from his ear. Static hissed faintly. He shrugged, lips parting. No sound. He pointed to his chest, then to the front of the tram, and drew a small circle in the air with his finger, round and round. A man a few seats back, older, with a scarf wrapped too tightly at his neck, leaned forward and produced a sound that might once have been a word. It escaped him as a thin, elongated exhale, shaped but voiceless, like wind coaxed through a crack in stone. Vesper recoiled before she could stop herself. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom. The word sorry arrived late to her own ears, trailing itself by a heartbeat, like a reflection catching up to its source. She pressed her fingers to her throat. It felt normal, warm, alive, still. Something essential had begun to thin. The tram burst briefly back into open air. This time, the scene outside was worse. A section of elevated track had collapsed on the main route, its concrete ribs exposed like broken teeth. A train lay half submerged in rainwater below, lights flickering as emergency crews swarmed the wreckage. The noise sirens, shouting, metal tearing reached the windows and then slid away, muted as the night tram skipped. The carriage lurched not forward, but aside, like a sidestep through space itself. The windows smeared. The sound fell away. When the image resolved, they were past it, safe. Vesper's knees buckled. She caught herself on a pole, chest heaving. The exertion felt disproportionate to the movement, like climbing stairs after a long illness. Mr. C appeared beside her without hurry. That one costs a little more, he said mildly. She looked up at him, rain-streaked devastation still burning in her vision. How much? 1 breath, he said. Same as before. Well, and you? She laughed, a reflex, thin and brittle, and was startled by the sound. It was quieter than laughter should be, arriving late, as if the emotion had to wait its turn to be heard. If I keep paying? She asked, voice softening further. What happens to me? Mr. C considered this carefully. You arrive. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters, he replied. Vesper closed her eyes. She pictured her flat, the narrow kitchen, the plant she kept alive out of stubbornness more than skill, the way her voice used to fill small rooms when she sang along to the radio, off-key but unafraid. She exhaled. This time, The breath left her more completely, a deeper surrender than before. The dizziness returned, heavier now, accompanied by a faint ringing in her ears. The tram responded with a smooth, grateful glide. "Thank you," Mr. C said. Vesper opened her eyes. "Okay," she said, and then frowned. The word appeared at her lips instantly. She felt it form, but the sound followed a moment later, detached, like an echo bouncing off a distant wall before returning. She tried again. "Hello." Her mouth moved. The sound came 2 beats late. A ripple passed through the passengers, those who could still react. The woman with the handbag nodded slowly, eyes sympathetic. The courier bagman lifted his shoulders in a helpless half shrug. Vesper sank back into her seat, pulse racing. The tram entered the longest tunnel yet. The lights dimmed to a twilight glow. The hum deepened, resonant enough to feel in her bones. Mr. C leaned casually against a pole nearby. "We'll be approaching a major convergence soon," he said. "It's noisy on the other side." Vesper swallowed, throat dry. "And the fare?" Mr. C smiled. "We'll discuss it when we get there." And the tram pressed forward, steady and unhurried, carrying its quiet passengers through a city that kept breaking just out of reach. Vesper listened to her own breathing, careful now, rationed, and wondered how many she had left that were truly hers. The tram slowed, not in the way vehicles usually did, no deceleration you could feel in your bones, no shift of weight forward, but in the way a thought slows just before it breaks. The hum beneath the floor deepened, stretched, as if time itself were being pulled thinner. Mr. C straightened. "This is where most people decide," he said, his voice still mild, still courteous. Vesper looked around. The passengers had gone very still. Those who could no longer speak watched with eyes that seemed too bright for the dim light. Pupils dilated, fixed on the windows as if they already knew what waited beyond them. Outside, the tunnel began to glow. Not with light, but with pressure, an unnatural brightness that bled through concrete and rain alike. The air in the carriage thickened, pressing against Vesper's chest so insistently that she had to consciously draw breath. Her breaths were shallow now, counted. The tram emerged. The world outside was in the middle of becoming something else. The section of track ahead had vanished, not collapsed, not broken, but removed, leaving a raw gap suspended over a churning pocket of fire and steam. An explosion had torn through the maintenance corridor beneath the rails, feeding on gas and water and old infrastructure all at once. Flames licked upward in erratic tongues. Debris rained down in slow, unreal arcs. Sirens screamed loud enough this time that Vesper felt them in her teeth. The night tram did not stop. It approached the gap with calm inevitability, wheels humming, body aligned as if the missing track were merely an inconvenience of perspective. Vesper gripped the seat in front of her, knuckles white. "You said this was safe." Mr. C nodded. "It can be." The tram reached the edge. The air screamed. Not audibly, not exactly, but with a violent pressure change that drove the breath from Vesper's lungs in a single, painful rush. She gasped reflexively, chest burning, vision dimming. Mr. C's hand closed gently but firmly around her wrist. "Too clear this," he said, close enough now that she could smell rain and metal on his coat. "We'll need one more payment." Vesper shook her head, dizzy. "I've already—" "Yes," he agreed. "And you've traveled far." The tram tilted slightly, hovering at the boundary where rails no longer existed. Outside, the fire surged higher, heat radiating through the glass in waves. "If I don't?" Vesper whispered. Mr. C looked out at the rupture, then back at her. "Then the shortcut ends here." "I doubt." She followed his gaze. For a fraction of a second, no longer, she saw herself below, standing in the rain, looking up at the gap too late. Saw the flash, the impact, the end that would have happened if she'd never boarded. Her heart hammered. Her lungs burned. "You won't take it," she said weakly. "You said it had to be voluntary." Mr. C smiled, softer than before. "It always is." The tram shuddered. Somewhere beneath them, the structure gave another violent groan. Vesper felt something inside her chest hesitate the instinct to breathe, caught between panic and refusal. Her mouth opened automatically, pulling in a thin, insufficient inhale that scraped painfully down her throat. She understood then. This wasn't about losing breath. It was about losing timing. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Not all of it. Just the last part, the part she would have needed to shout, to sing, to cry out without delay. The part that made breath immediate and voice synchronous. The tram leapt, not forward, elsewhere. The sensation defied language, like being pulled sideways through a memory, like skipping a beat in the heart of the world. The explosion vanished. The heat dropped away. The sound cut off mid-siren. The tram landed on intact rails with a muted, almost tender clatter. Safe? Vesper collapsed into the seat, lungs spasming as air rushed back in. She breathed shallowly, then deeper still, until the pain dulled into a manageable ache. Mr. C released her wrist. "Thank you," he said, with genuine warmth this time. That was sufficient. The tram resumed its steady pace, the hum beneath the floor smoothing out, the lights brightening slightly as the pressure eased. Outside the windows, the city reassembled itself into something intact. Vesper opened her eyes. She tried to speak. Her lips moved instantly. The sound came later, a soft, delayed echo of her own voice, arriving as if it had traveled a longer route than she had. Mr. C watched her carefully. "You'll arrive shortly," he said, as promised. Vesper leaned her head back against the window, rain cool against the glass, and listened to her breathing, still present, still hers, but no longer fully obedient. The tram carried on through the night, and the gap behind them closed, unnoticed by a world that had never known how close it came to ending. Vesper arrived without ceremony. The night tram slowed one final time, its doors opening onto a street she recognized instantly, not because it looked welcoming, but because it looked ordinary. Rain-dark pavement, a closed cafe with chairs stacked upside down, the familiar orange glow of a street lamp humming faintly in the drizzle. Her stop. Mr. C stood by the door, posture relaxed, as if escorting her off any late service. "Mind the step," he said kindly. Vesper rose on unsteady legs. The floor felt solid beneath her feet, reassuring in its refusal to sway. As she stepped onto the pavement, the door slid shut behind her with a gentle sound, barely louder than rain on glass. The tram pulled away. No sparks, no distortion, no sense of finality. It simply continued. Vesper stood alone beneath the street lamp, rain soaking slowly into her hair and jacket, lungs drawing in air that felt thinner than it used to, but still sufficient. She tested her balance, took a step, then another. Home was 3 blocks away. She walked carefully, listening to the city breathe around her. The usual night sounds returned: distant traffic, water rushing through gutters, a siren far off but moving away this time. Alive. At her flat, she unlocked the door on the first try. The familiar smell greeted her: dust, detergent, the faint green note of the plant she kept by the window. She kicked off her shoes and leaned her forehead briefly against the doorframe, letting herself feel the ache in her chest, the exhaustion settling into muscle and bone. Safe, she told herself. She crossed to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, hands steady now. The tap ran clean. No hesitation, no patterns. She drank. The water went down smoothly, cool and unremarkable. Vesper laughed softly, relief bubbling up at last. "I made it," she said. Her lips moved. Nothing happened. For a heartbeat, panic flared sharp and bright. Then her voice arrived. "I made it," it said, softly, from a place just behind the moment. Vesper froze. She tried again. "Hello?" Her mouth formed the word immediately. The sound followed 2 seconds later, faintly reverberant, like a voice calling from the far end of a tunnel. "Hello?" She pressed a hand to her throat. Swallowed. Breathed in deeply. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The echo replied, late, but accurate. Vesper sank into a chair, heart pounding. The delay was consistent, not random, not worsening, just there, a fixed distance between intention and arrival, as though her voice now traveled a longer route than the rest of her. She tested it carefully. speaking short phrases, watching her reflection in the darkened window. Her lips moved, her breath followed, her voice arrived after. Always 2 seconds behind. Outside, rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent. The city did not react. No alarm sounded, no tram screeched to a halt. The world accepted her as she was. Later, in bed, Vesper lay awake, listening to her own breathing, attuned now to the subtle lag between inhale and exhale. It wasn't dangerous. It didn't hurt, but it meant something. She understood, then, what she had paid. Not her life, not even her breath, but immediacy. Her voice no longer belonged entirely to the present. It came to her by way of somewhere else, some shortcut she could no longer see, but could still feel echoing faintly behind every word. Tomorrow, she would have to explain it. To coworkers, to doctors, to people who would nod politely and offer explanations that didn't quite fit. She would learn when to speak early, when to wait, when silence was simpler. Vesper turned onto her side and closed her eyes. In the quiet, just before sleep claimed her, she thought she heard the faint hum of rails somewhere far below the city, steady, patient, moving on. And when she breathed out, the sound of it reached her ears a moment later than it should have. Still hers, just delayed. The transmission is ending now, not because everything has been resolved, but because the allotted time has been used. If you're still awake, that's expected. None of these systems were designed to return people to normal. They were designed to keep functioning. The tree still counts. The kitchen will still correct what's left overnight. The road remains open only to those who acknowledge it. The pipes still carry more than water. And somewhere, the night service continues its route without asking where you were trying to go. If you plan to sleep after this, allow a moment of silence first. Not to calm yourself, but to make sure nothing follows you out. This signal will not repeat. If you hear it again another night, it won't be intentional. Until then, you may disconnect at your discretion. End of transmission.